But of course you know that I paid a brief visit to Columbia in 1865. And what you might not know is I spent 4 years in the Low Country when I was a lieutenant, but I'll get to that in a little while. I was asked here tonight to talk to you about what I did in South Carolina and Georgia and North Carolina in 1864 and 1865. But before I do that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in 1820 in Lancaster, Ohio. When I was 9, my father died. And my mother, faced with trying to support 11 children, did what most people did in those days, in those kind of circumstances. She kept the youngest ones and farmed the rest of us out to friends and family. I was taken by a good neighbor and good friend of my father's, Thomas Ewing. He told my mother, "Give me the brightest of the lot, and I'll make a man of him." He did a good job. Mr. Ewing treated me like one of his own sons. And when I was 16, he decided that I should have a military career. And since he had good political connections, he quickly arranged an appointment for me to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York. I adapted rather smoothly to that harsh environment and graduated 6th out of the 42 lieutenants in the class of 1840. Please get all these dates confused. The Seminole War was going on at the time, and my first assignment was to Florida. When that war was concluded, my unit returned to its home base, which is Fort Moultrie in the Charleston Harbor. I had a delightful 4 years at Fort Moultrie. The duties were light, hunting and fishing was great, and the shiny buttons on our Army uniforms served as entry to Charleston high society. My tour in the Low Country was ended when the Mexican-American War started, and my unit was shipped to California to take possession of that Spanish province. We spent 198 days aboard ship, going around the Cape of Horn, and by the time we arrived, American citizens who were living in California when the war started had already seized the reins of power, and we had nothing to do except be an occupation army. The gold rush made Army salaries very paltry, and I soon decided that if I was going to support a growing family, I would need some other profession. So I resigned from the Army and became a banker. I ran the San Francisco branch of a St. Louis bank, but the St. Louis bank collapsed in a financial panic. Because I'd earned a good reputation there, I was sent to New York to run the branch of another St. Louis bank, and it also collapsed in another financial panic. About this time, I decided that banking was just akin to gambling, and I decided I had to do something else. Fortunately, one of my Army friends told me that some wealthy planters in Louisiana were establishing a college and were looking for a superintendent. I applied and was quickly appointed the superintendent of the Louisiana Learning Seminary and Military Academy. There was a lot to be done. When I got down there was nothing but an empty building. But I soon patterned the curriculum on that at West Point, and on the 1st of January, 1860, we opened our doors to our first class. Now at this time, many of the wealthy planter class were talking about cessation. I tried to convince them that was foolish. I tried to say the North has more men than you do. The North has almost all the industry in the United States. But they wouldn't listen to me. They were convinced that they could secede without war. So since I'd sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, domestic and foreign, I resigned my position as superintendent and went north. The North was also preparing for war, and I soon found myself a colonel in the U.S. Army, trying to train a regiment of absolutely green 90-day volunteers just south of Washington. The politicians insisted that we attack the Confederate positions around Bull Run long before we had our men even half trained. Initially, we did pretty well, but when there was a defeat on one wing, the Union Army dissolved and fled back to the defenses of Washington in a panic. I told some of my friends we'd probably be reduced in rank as a result of our role in that debacle, but instead I found myself promoted to Brigadier General. An old Army friend, Brigadier General Anderson, the hero of Fort Sumter, was assigned by Lincoln to keep Kentucky in the Union. General Anderson was a Kentuckian. He asked me if I would go with him to Kentucky as his deputy, and I was perfectly willing to do this. Unfortunately, when we got to Kentucky, General Anderson's health broke and I found myself in command. I had too few troops, and those untrained and poorly equipped. I had 100 details to take care of on supply and government. I believe, looking back on it, that I smoked too much, drank too much, and slept too little. The Secretary of War came by my headquarters to inquire as to how things were going, and he had several people with him. I asked him to meet with me in private so that I could honestly tell him what was going on. He said, no, these people are dependable. You don't have to worry about them. Go ahead and tell me anything you want to. So I told him that if he wanted me to hold Kentucky, I needed 10 times as many soldiers as I had. And if he wanted me to carry out the offensive operations he was suggesting, I'd need 20 times as many. When Secretary of War Cameron left, he told his entourage, I don't know where I'm going to get the number of troops. That's a crazy demand. Well, one of his companions was a newspaper reporter. And very shortly, Sherman's crazy appears in headlines. I wasn't crazy, but I was exhausted. I was relieved and sent back to Ohio on sick leave. 2 or 3 weeks with my family, I was perfectly okay again. And another old Army friend, General Halleck, who was now in command of all forces in the West, called me to St. Louis to be one of his staff officers. After he had convinced himself that I wasn't crazy, he assigned me command of a division that was forming around Paducah, Kentucky. One of my jobs was providing some logistic support to a force being assembled under a general that nobody had ever heard of by this time, Ulysses Grant. I was very impressed with Grant. He had great common sense. He was very aggressive. We formed a close friendship that lasted throughout the war, and I became one of his closest associates. Lincoln had been having trouble finding a general. When he saw all of the victories that Grant piled up in 1862 and 1863, he realized he had a general who could win. So he called Grant to Washington and gave him command of all of the Union armies. Also promoted him to lieutenant general, a rank that no one had held in our army since Washington. Before he left for the East, General Grant put me in command of all the forces in the West. Grant was always very short and succinct in his directive, and the mission he gave me was to go after the Confederate force commanded by Joe Johnson that was just south of Chattanooga, break it up, get as far into the enemy country as I could, and do as much damage to enemy resources as I could. Now, some people say amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. The problem I faced is, how am I going to feed 100,000 men in this very poor country between Chattanooga and Atlanta? It's mountainous. There were hardly any roads. The farms were small and poor. There was no way we could live off the land. There was a railroad running from Chattanooga to Atlanta, and it was obvious that I was going to have to support my army by supplies brought in over that railroad. That was as obvious to my Confederate opponent as it was to me. He assumed his mission was to keep me from moving down that railroad toward Atlanta. I spent several months accumulating the mountains of supplies that we were going to need, and then early in May we started south. I need to tell you a little bit about how tactics had evolved from the ones we used first in 1860 to the ones that we were using in 1864. At West Point, we had studied the battles of Napoleon, where two armies lined up face to face, marched to within 50 yards or so of each other, and began to blaze away until one or the other collapsed. The smoothbore muskets those people were using were so inaccurate that your chances of hitting a man at 50 yards were pretty slim. So soldiers were told not even to aim, just lower your musket, hold it horizontally and pull the trigger. And there's a lot of balls going out there, somebody's going to get hurt. Well, we did, and that's the way we tried to fight the early battles of the Civil War. But there'd been a technological change that we didn't appreciate. Troops had used smoothbore muskets. By 1860, the troops on both sides were equipped with rifles. And a good marksman with a rifle could kill a man at 300 yards, and they could hit a large body of soldiers at several times that range. So this idea of lining up in pretty lines and walking up on an enemy was proven to be insane. Our troops soon learned that if you had a few minutes before a fight, cut down some trees, lay them in front of you, build a little breastwork and throw dirt on top, and that would stop bullets. And a few men behind the breastwork of that type could defeat a far larger force trying to assault them. So both of our armies were very good at field fortifications. So Johnson made some strong fortifications across the railroad. And I had two choices, didn't I? I could have attacked him directly and tried to drive him out of those positions, or I could attempt to flank him, to get behind him and threaten his railway communications with Atlanta. I certainly didn't want to take the casualties that would be involved with the direct assault. So we moved against Johnson, came up against his lines, dug in. So there's two dug-in forces facing each other. Then we detached a large part of our force to circle around to the west behind Johnston and threaten his rail communications. When he saw his communications threatened, he would have to draw back. Now, I'm not going to bore you with details, but Joe Johnson and I played that dance all the way down to the fortifications of Atlanta. He would fortify a position, we would move up, send a force out to get on the railroad behind him, and he would pull back. We arrived in front of Atlanta in July. The fortifications of Atlanta were formidable. Obviously, we were not going to assault those fortifications, which had been prepared over several years. So instead, we settled down for a siege. We sent for heavy artillery, and we began to bombard the city of Atlanta. At this time, Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, did us a tremendous favor. He never did like Joe Johnston, and he was very angry at the fact that Johnston had let us move all the way from Chattanooga to Atlanta without attacking us. So he relieved Johnston and replaced him with John Bell Hood, a known fighter. We couldn't have hoped for anything better. We couldn't get Johnston to get out of his trenches where we could get at him, but we knew that wouldn't be a problem with Hood. Within a few days of his appointment to command, Hood launched several violent attacks on our position. All were repulsed, and he took heavy casualties. He cut his forces down to the point where they could do nothing but defend the fortifications. We had now cut all but one railroad bringing supplies into Atlanta from the south. When we finally moved around to the west and cut that railroad, John Bell Hood had no choice except to abandon Atlanta, which he did. And on the 1st of September, I wired Washington, Atlanta is ours and fairly won. Now this was much more important than just a seizure of a Confederate rail center. Lincoln was seriously worried about whether he could win the election of 1864. There was a lot of war weariness in the North. People were beginning to say, is there a chance we can ever beat these people? The fall of Atlanta, the fall of Mobile, Sherman's destruction of the Shenandoah Valley, all buoyed Northern morale. And the result of the election was that Lincoln was reelected with about 10 times the electoral votes of his Democratic opponent. Now, what was it going to do with Atlanta? I'm there. Hood moved north and launched several forays against my railroad connections with Chattanooga. And I finally decided that rather than chasing Hood all over northern Georgia and northern Alabama, I would send part of my forces north, large enough to defend against anything Hood might do, and with the rest, I would move southwest, southeast. So I stripped my forces down. I had about 100,000 men to start, but I stripped that down to 60,000 of the healthiest. I sent all weak, sick, back to Chattanooga, and I cut down the number of wagons we carried. I cut down the amount of artillery, and we moved out southwest. Now, I employed a tactic here that was very successful. I threatened several Confederate objectives at once, and when they split their forces to defend against them, I moved between. When we moved out of Atlanta in 2 columns, I made a fake attack toward Macon, which is where the South's largest powder factory was located. I made a feint toward Augusta, and then I went between them, headed for Savannah. There were no Confederate forces opposing us, only the light cavalry of General Wheeler to keep track of where we were. I told my men, forage liberally on the countryside, and they did. They took horses, mules, cattle, pigs, chickens, hams in the smokehouse, sweet potatoes. We stripped a 60-mile wide swath through Georgia. Some of my men said it was a picnic. Others said they'd never eaten so well in their entire time in the Army. Somebody else said, yeah, and I gained weight. So we arrived outside the fortifications of Savannah, Georgia, mid-December. I called on General Hardee, the Confederate commander, to surrender the city, but he refused. So I thought I had another siege on my hands, and I sent back north for heavy artillery. About a week later, General Hardee saw that I was about to cut off his last escape route from Savannah and he abandoned the city. We marched in with no opposition. They weren't happy to see us, but we had no violent opposition. And I put my troops under tight control. And if you talk to the people from Savannah, they'll tell you that federal occupation was not a bad thing. This was a winter that had the heaviest rains anybody had seen in years. My Confederate opponents were convinced that I was stuck in Savannah until spring because lower South Carolina swamps were flooded. They didn't reckon with my troops and my engineers. We left Savannah on the 1st of February, headed north. Again, I threatened Macon. Again, I threatened Charleston. And my opponents split their meager forces to defend them both, and I went in between. 2 weeks later, we were in Columbia. Now, we'd only been able to move about half as fast in the 2 weeks going from Savannah to Columbia as we had out in sunny Georgia. But we arrived. When General Wade Hampton, who now commanded the Confederate cavalry, pulled out of Columbia, he set fire to a lot of bales of cotton that had been sent to Columbia for safekeeping. The high wind spread those burning bits of cotton and started a number of fires. The division that I put into Columbia quickly broke into liquor stores and private liquor cellars, and I soon had drunken troops all over Columbia joyfully spreading the fires. The building that I'd chosen as my headquarters was almost consumed. So my staff and I became firefighters. We called in the sober division on the outskirts to restore order and fight fires. They finally did this by dawn, but by that time about 2/3 of the buildings in Columbia had been burned to the ground. 3 days later, we left to smoking Columbia and headed northeast. Once again, I threatened Cheraw, I threatened Charlotte, and I moved on Fayetteville, North Carolina. Let me tell you where I'm really headed in this. My plans are to march through North Carolina and southern Virginia and come up opposite Lee's forces who were entrenched at Petersburg. And then with my army on one side and Grant's army on the other side, we'd either crush Lee between us or force him to surrender. Our principal objective in Fayetteville was a beautiful arsenal, federal arsenal, that the Confederates had turned into a Confederate arsenal and used to produce a lot of their weaponry. I didn't think that after this, the United States would trust North Carolina with an arsenal for a while. And so we destroyed it completely, stone by stone. We destroyed all the railways leading in, and after about a week, we headed north. Now, my intermediate objection here is Goldsboro, North Carolina, because Goldsboro is in communication with Wilmington, now in federal hands, who's going to send me supplies, shoes, uniforms, and so on for my troops. General Joe Johnston was now placed back in command of all the meager Confederate forces that were facing us. And he decided, since I was marching in two wings separated by 10 or 12 miles, that he could delay us best by striking at one of those wings before the other could come to its assistance. He hit us at Bentonville on 19 March and was defeated and driven out. Now, I could have probably focused my whole force on him and destroyed him at the time, but I was more concerned with resupplying my troops, incorporating the reinforcements that we had received in preparation for the last march up to Petersburg. We're only 100 miles now south of Lee and his entrenchments in Petersburg. Before we moved out of Goldsboro, we received word that Lee had surrendered to Grant on the 8th. Needless to say, there was great rejoicing in our camp. And after a week or so, General Johnson wrote me and said, "Since Lee surrendered, don't you think it would be appropriate for us to get together and arrange terms?" Now, the week before, I had gone up the coast to Petersburg to meet with Lincoln and Grant. And Lincoln told us he wanted to let the South down easy. It was obvious that the end of the war was coming. And so when I met with Johnson, I gave him very generous terms. I suggested that the soldiers be assembled under their officers and marched back to their state capitals to turn in their weapons. I suggested that civilian office holders should resume their office once they had given an oath of allegiance to the United States. I was very pleased with this. I thought I was doing something that Lincoln would have wanted me to do. Unfortunately, by the time these terms got to Washington, Lincoln had been assassinated and Washington was like a beehive. Essentially, Secretary of War Stanton was in command, and he denounced my terms, not just to me, but to the newspapers. He said, "Sherman's a traitor. Sherman's probably been bought off by Confederate gold to offer terms like this. These terms are rejected." And he sent General Grant down to my headquarters. And so Grant had me meet General Johnston again, and we agreed to the same surrender terms that Lee and Grant had used. This whole thing is very distasteful to me. I think that a lot of the bitterness between the North and the South could have been avoided if my terms had been accepted. But the radical Republicans in Washington did not want to let the South down easy. They wanted the South punished. I think you will agree with me that Reconstruction with Union troops occupying all critical places in the South was a terrible mistake and left a real legacy of hatred between our two sections. Mr. Burns?
As a result of all the gunfire that General Sherman has been exposed to, he's become quite deaf. So he's asked me he's given me a request that you direct your questions to me so that I can convey them to him loudly enough that he can understand it.
Thank you, sir. Question?
Yes, sir.
Who was Sherman's closest military friend on the Confederate side? Perhaps they were both at the point at the same time.
Who was Sherman's closest Confederate friend on the southern side? Perhaps they had gone to West Point together.
I had so many of my classmates in the South. I didn't have a roommate. There were many the Union generals had their roommates as their Confederate officers. I was a great admirer of General Johnston, my opponent, and I thought he did a superb job. He caused us to spend 75 days in moving 100 miles from Chattanooga to Atlanta, and he never came out in the open where we could inflict really heavy casualties. He was a very, very skilled man, and after the war, he and I became close friends. You know, I just need to say here something that I neglected. 5 years after the war, Atlanta invited me back to show how they'd rebuilt the country. And I was well received. It's only this lost cause movement among the daughters and sons of those who fought and died on the Confederate side that really has preserved this terrible bitterness between our two sides of the nation.
And the carpetbaggers didn't help.
The carpetbaggers, that's Reconstruction. Lincoln would have never allowed that. But that was a sad part. And the carpetbaggers were, of course, backed up by Union troops. And Union troops don't belong in a police option.
General, you said your orders were to move south of Chattanooga to Atlanta. When you got there, you said you decided to move farther. Under whose authority did you make that decision?
I had discussed this with my superior, General Sherman, General Grant. And he was not enthusiastic about the idea initially. He told me, "Don't you think you ought to run Hood to ground first?" But I argued with him and said, "I'm going to send General Thomas north with enough troops to handle anything that Hood can do." And I wanted to demonstrate that the Confederacy was a hollow shell and that the Union could march through it at its pleasure. I had realized now that we weren't just fighting a hostile army, we were fighting a hostile people. And I believed that until the civilians felt the heavy hand of war, the war would not end. And when somebody complained, I told them, war is war and not popularity seeking. War is cruelty, and there's no way you can refine it. If you want it stopped, get your sons and friends to stop fighting. Yeah.
Yes.
How old were you at the end of the war?
How old were you at the end of the war?
Well, I was born in 20, and the war ended in 65, so I was 45. After the war, we established a mandatory retirement age of 64. So I'm just about there.
Yes, sir.
Where did you get a funny name like Tecumseh?
Do you honestly want me to ask you that question? Where did you get the funny name like your middle name, Tecumseh?
My father was a great admirer of the Indian chief Tecumseh, who had tried to unify the Indian tribes of the Midwest to resist white encroachment. He tried to name his first son Tecumseh, but my mother insisted that he be named for her father. He tried to name his second son Tecumseh, but she insisted that he be named for her brother. By the time I came along, she had no more brothers and sisters.
What about this understanding in this part of the world that you had a scorched earth policy and burned a wide swath of everything in your path as you moved from Atlanta and then up to Columbia and on?
That's a little extreme. I got that one. That's a little extreme, but it's close. We didn't burn houses.
You did not.
As we marched through Georgia, we consumed everything that could be consumed. We left a desert behind us. We destroyed railroads, we destroyed factories, we destroyed bridges, and there wasn't much left in the way of food in that, or horses or mules or wagons or anything else of military value in that 60-mile wide swath we got. I'm afraid it was worse in South Carolina. Because South Carolina started the war, my troops seemed to feel that South Carolina should be punished. And unknown to me, my cavalry commander told his cavalrymen before they left, be sure you have your saddlebags full of matches. Okay? And after they had moved through Barnwell, they joked that that was the wrong name, it should be called Burnwell. And in South Carolina, you could follow the track of our army by the chimneys. So there was a lot of destruction. When we moved from South Carolina to North Carolina, I issued orders saying, back off. North Carolina has a lot of federal supporters. Okay, North Carolina came into the war late and reluctantly. So, you know, I don't really mind what you did to South Carolina, but we're in a different area now. Attica?
Okay. Are you going to just take your coat off for a minute?
Sir?
How are we shutting this down?
Okay.
Okay. As you know, this is, of course, your own HWLacquement. I realize you want to, yeah.
General, why did you not assault Charleston?
Why did you not assault Charleston?
There was nothing in Charleston I wanted. The Union had besieged Charleston. They held the outer islands, and they'd turned Charleston, and it was pretty much used up. And there was nothing in there. The folks in Charleston had been sending their cotton north because they thought I was coming for Charleston. Okay, but there was nothing in Charleston I needed. My goal was to get to Southern Virginia. Okay, so Charleston was out of my way. But it was useful to threaten it because it was so important to the Confederates, and they put a lot of troops in there. Yep.
Along those same lines, there are stories about why you didn't burn Savannah, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Savannah surrendered. Savannah surrendered. It was very peaceful. The mayor came out and offered us a city, and there was no value in burning Savannah. I wrote the 22nd of December of '64. I wrote President Lincoln, I would like to offer you the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and more than 25,000 bales of cotton as a Christmas present. So Savannah never gave us any trouble. Once the Confederates had evacuated the place, there was no need to destroy it.
As a follow-up, I'm taking all your time. There's a rumor that a certain woman in Savannah, who was kind of a heroine, had some persuasive powers that enabled you not to burn Savannah. Is that just a rumor?
I think it's a rumor. Now, the ladies of Savannah, I must admit, were not particularly happy with us, nor were any other of the Confederate ladies we passed. And we often got a real tongue lashing as we went through. But I want you to notice the difference between what would happen with our Christian army of the North going through enemy terrain with almost no personal injuries. Okay, we didn't kill people, we didn't rape people. There was almost no personal injury. Now compare that with with what happened in Germany in the 30 Years' War. Where in the 30 Years' War, the population of Central Europe dropped by 1/3. Okay, but you didn't see that in the path of my army. I said in my memoirs that there were no rapes. I've since learned that's not true. There were 2, and both of those men were hung. A lot of the violence that was done by what they call bummers, okay, that are out on both sides of the army. There were Union deserters, Confederate deserters, criminals that the governor of Georgia had released from the Georgia State Prison when we approached. All those guys undisciplined, under no kind of control, and they committed some real outrages. There's also Wheeler's cavalry out there trying to keep track of us. And Wheeler had not had a single ration issued to him since he left Atlanta. Now, where do you think Wheeler's troops got food? Same place we were doing, right? And some people we passed said Wheeler's men were worse than ours.
Oh, yes, sir.
How long did it take you to realize, not having gone through Charleston, that you missed going to heaven?
How long did it take you to realize you regretted not going through Charleston?
I never regretted it. I never regretted it. I had a mission, okay? I was headed for Virginia to help.
I don't think he's that concerned about it.
Okay.
He's trying to get in an endorsement of Charleston.
Oh, well, I loved Charleston when I was a lieutenant, but I had no use for it when I was a general.
By the way, I'm from Charleston, West Virginia, so let's just not.
That's it.
Okay, you.
I mean, he is a member of your congregation and everything else, but he's also my dearest friend. We've been at Greenville Tech. I came in 1984, and he's just really done a lot of really good stuff.